He was 17, bright but brittle, and that morning at Lincoln High, Jamal stood in the principal's office staring down at his shoes, silent, while two adults argued over his future. His mother clutched her purse tight, her voice cracking as she defended him, but the words seemed useless against a wall of accusations. Fights, insubordination, and now one reckless outburst in class. His last chance was gone. Meanwhile, across town, Rachel Jennings was sitting in her small therapy office, staring at her notes from their last session. Jamal's anger had been building, but beneath it, she'd seen something raw and honest, a kid who wanted more than anything to be heard. She rubbed her temples, wondering if there was still a way to help him before everything unraveled. What neither of them knew was that by day's end, both their lives would change in ways neither could have imagined. Jamal's suspension hit hard, but it was nothing new to him. Sitting on his bed that afternoon, the silence in the apartment felt heavier than usual. His mother was in the next room, making phone calls that ended in frustration or silence. They'd been here before, but this time felt different. Meanwhile, Rachel sat in a meeting with her supervisor, pushing for one last chance to keep Jamal in the program. She argued that expelling him from therapy would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. Her supervisor frowned, warning her not to get too personally involved. Rachel knew the line between caring and crossing boundaries was thin, but Jamal wasn't just another name in a file to her. That evening, she sent him a message offering to meet outside of school, a move that made her uneasy but felt necessary. Jamal read the message twice before replying with a simple word, "Okay." They met at a small park near his apartment, just as the sun was setting. Jamal was distant at first, leaning back on the bench, hoodie up, arms crossed. Rachel sat beside him but gave him space, waiting, letting the silence settle. Slowly, his words started to come out, sharp at first, blaming the school, his teachers, the system. But then they softened, and Rachel listened without interrupting. He talked about the pressure, about feeling invisible until he exploded, and how tired he was of always being the problem. Rachel's heart broke listening to him, and she realized in that moment that therapy couldn't fix everything, but it could be a lifeline. She told him they'd find a way forward together. Jamal looked at her, eyes glassy, and for the first time in weeks, he nodded. Neither noticed the woman sitting at a nearby table, watching them closely and taking quiet photos on her phone. The fallout came faster than either expected. The next morning, Rachel was called into the director's office. Photos of her and Jamal at the park were spread across the desk, accompanied by formal complaints from anonymous sources. Questions were fired at her. Why meet a student off-site? Why breach protocol? What were her true intentions? Rachel felt her stomach twist as she tried to explain, but her words sounded thin against the growing tide of suspicion. Meanwhile, Jamal arrived at school to find whispers following him down the hall. A teacher pulled him aside, asking pointed questions that made his chest tighten with shame and confusion. By noon, Rachel's suspension was official pending an investigation, and Jamal was told his school placement was being reviewed again. What had started as a quiet act of care now looked, to outsiders, like something much darker, and neither Jamal nor Rachel had the power to stop the narrative spiraling out of control. Rachel spent the evening on her couch, phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and friends offering cautious support. She felt numb, staring at the wall, her license now hanging by a thread. Jamal sat on the curb outside his apartment, watching kids from his block ride their bikes and laugh like nothing had changed. But everything had. He wondered if talking had been a mistake, if trusting anyone was just another trap. His mom came outside and sat next to him in silence, her presence heavy with unspoken worry. Rachel's lawyer called her that night, advising her to keep quiet and let the investigation run its course. Jamal, meanwhile, lay awake in bed, scrolling through social media and seeing his own name twisted in rumors he couldn't recognize. Both of them had set out to heal something broken, but now, they were both the ones bleeding, and no one seemed to care why. Days passed, and the silence from the school board and licensing board grew louder than words. Rachel found herself cut off from her clients, her routines stripped down to waiting and worrying. Every glance from neighbors felt heavier, as if they too had read the headlines and formed quiet judgments. Jamal, now at home full-time, drifted between anger and numbness. His mother, exhausted but determined, began making phone calls to advocacy groups, desperate to find someone who would listen. Meanwhile, Jamal's friends kept their distance, uncertain about what was true and what was rumor. The world around them seemed to freeze, but the damage kept spreading. Rachel sat in her kitchen one night, staring at her untouched dinner, wondering how something meant to help had become so twisted. Jamal lay awake, headphones on, blocking out the noise, but deep down he was haunted by the same question: was speaking up ever really worth it? The first public article hit by the end of the week, painting Rachel as reckless and Jamal as a troubled teen who had crossed a line. Neither had spoken publicly, but that didn't stop the flood of assumptions. Rachel's phone buzzed non-stop with reporters requesting interviews, but her lawyer's warning rang in her ears: stay silent, no matter how unfair it feels. Jamal's schoolmates flooded his inbox with everything from cruel memes to quiet support, but the shame clung to him like a second skin. One afternoon, Rachel found herself standing outside her office building, staring at the door she was no longer allowed to enter. Jamal, across town, sat on his stoop watching the mailman drop another thick envelope, another hearing notice. They were both being judged in rooms they couldn't enter, by people who didn't know them, and all they could do was wait and hope that truth would somehow cut through the noise. Rachel's parents drove up to visit, their concerns spilling out in careful words and long hugs. They asked if she regretted getting so involved, but Rachel's eyes stayed focused on the floor. She couldn't answer because part of her still believed she had done the right thing. Jamal's mother, meanwhile, worked double shifts, her shoulders tightening under the weight of legal bills and unanswered questions. Jamal spent more time at the park, headphones on, eyes watching but mind elsewhere. He noticed Rachel's car pull up one afternoon, parking at a distance, and for a moment they locked eyes across the grass. No words, just a silent understanding that both of them were now trapped in something bigger than either had imagined. Rachel drove off quickly, her heart pounding, knowing even that brief moment could be twisted if seen by the wrong eyes. Jamal sat back, staring at the sky, wondering when things had become so broken. The hearings began, sterile rooms filled with stiff chairs and cold questions. Rachel sat in front of a panel, every word of her defense picked apart. They asked her if she had personal feelings for Jamal, if she understood the risks, if she regretted the choices she made. She answered calmly, her voice steady but her hands shaking under the table. Across the city, Jamal was questioned too, this time by a school board committee. He was asked why he agreed to meet Rachel outside of school, what they talked about, whether he felt safe. His answers were honest, but he could tell they weren't really listening. They had already made up their minds. Rachel left her hearing drained and hollow, her lawyer's expression tight-lipped. Jamal walked out of his, head down, his mother clutching his arm. The truth was on the table, but truth, they were learning, didn't always win. Weeks dragged by, and the waiting became its own kind of torture. Rachel filled her days with walks and books, trying to silence the spiraling thoughts. She'd spent years building her reputation, and now it all hinged on strangers in a room she couldn't enter again. Jamal, restless and angry, started writing everything down, his feelings, his side of the story, everything no one seemed to care about. His mother found his notebook one night and cried quietly over the pages, heartbroken by how much her son carried alone. Rachel got a letter in the mail one rainy afternoon, her hands trembling as she opened it. Jamal's mother, too, opened a letter the same day. The words were short and sharp: Rachel's license suspended indefinitely, and Jamal permanently expelled. No appeals, no room for explanations. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, staring at the words, and Jamal ripped his letter in two, tears burning his eyes. Silence had spoken louder than justice once again. Rachel woke up the next morning and stared at the ceiling, her mind numb from the weight of finality. Her career, once her pride and anchor, had been stripped away with a single decision. She thought about calling friends, but the words felt too heavy, and most of them had already drifted away, afraid of being caught in the fallout. Jamal spent the day pacing the apartment, unable to sit still, his anger bubbling just under the surface. His mother urged him to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble, but Jamal's heart felt like it was splitting open. They had tried to play by the rules, to speak their truth, and still, they had been silenced. That evening, Jamal pulled out his notebook again and began to write, not for the school, not for the lawyers, but for himself. Rachel, too, sat down at her computer, opening a blank document, unsure of where to begin but knowing she had to try. Jamal's world shrank quickly. Friends who once joked with him now crossed the street to avoid him. Teachers who once smiled now looked away. Even at home, the silence between him and his mother grew, both of them too exhausted to keep rehashing the same pain. Rachel, on the other hand, found herself haunted by what-ifs. She kept playing back the park meeting in her mind, every word, every look, wondering how something so small had grown so big. She started researching cases like hers, realizing that what felt personal was part of a much bigger pattern. Jamal's mother, meanwhile, began attending community meetings, pushing past her own exhaustion to make sure her son's story wasn't buried. One night, Jamal overheard her talking on the phone, her voice fierce and shaking as she promised she wouldn't let this break him. Rachel, sitting alone in her apartment, whispered that same promise to herself. The weeks stretched into months, and slowly, new paths began to form. Rachel took a part-time job at a bookstore, her once busy days now quiet and small. People still whispered when they saw her, but she forced herself to hold her head high. Jamal, too, found small escapes, basketball games at the park, long walks with his headphones, moments where he felt almost normal. His mother pushed him to apply to new schools, but every rejection letter hit like another slap. Rachel attended a panel discussion one evening about youth justice, sitting in the back, unnoticed. Listening to other stories of broken systems and lost kids, she felt both comforted and enraged. Jamal, on his end, started volunteering at a youth center, drawn in by the chance to help kids even younger than himself. Neither Rachel nor Jamal spoke again, but unknowingly, they both had begun to rebuild in their own quiet ways. Jamal's writing turned into something more than a notebook: poems, essays, raw pieces of his heart poured out onto paper. His mother read them quietly at night, tears in her eyes but pride swelling in her chest. She began sharing them with close friends, who passed them along to others. Soon, a local community leader reached out, asking Jamal if he'd read one of his poems at an upcoming event. Rachel, meanwhile, was encouraged by a friend to submit an op-ed to a local paper. Nervous but determined, she told her side of the story, carefully, without names or accusations, but with enough truth to stir quiet waves. The article was published one chilly morning, and Rachel watched nervously as comments rolled in, a mix of quiet support and bitter criticism. Jamal, holding his mother's hand, stood on a small stage in the community center that same week, his voice shaking but strong as he read his words aloud for the first time. The night of Jamal's reading, something shifted. The crowd, small but engaged, listened with quiet respect as he poured out his frustration, his hurt, but also his hope. His mother stood at the back, tears streaming as she watched her son reclaim a piece of himself. Rachel, miles away, sat in her apartment scrolling through messages from strangers who had read her op-ed, some offering understanding, others still sharp with judgment. Yet for the first time in months, she felt something loosen inside her. Jamal left the event that night with a quiet smile, surprised by how good it felt to be heard on his own terms. His mother hugged him tight, whispering that no one could take away his voice now. Rachel, sitting by her window with a cup of tea, looked up at the night sky and allowed herself to hope, just a little, that maybe healing was possible, even when justice had failed. Jamal's poem rippled through the neighborhood, sparking quiet conversations at dinner tables and community meetings. People who had once dismissed his story now paused, rethinking their assumptions. Rachel noticed a subtle shift too. Her former colleagues, once distant, started sending cautious messages of support. None of it erased what had happened, but it made the isolation feel a little less suffocating. Jamal was invited to another event, this time at a nearby high school, to talk about youth voices and injustice. He hesitated, unsure if he could face another crowd, but his mother's gentle encouragement pushed him forward. Rachel, meanwhile, volunteered to help at a local mentoring program, realizing that even without her license, she still had something to give. Their worlds, once tangled together and then torn apart, were slowly finding new orbits, each of them searching for meaning in the wreckage. At the high school event, Jamal stood before a sea of unfamiliar faces, heart pounding but words steady. He shared his story, careful but honest, focusing on what it meant to be heard, and to be silenced. The students listened, some nodding in understanding, others quietly stunned. Afterward, a girl approached him, saying his words made her feel less alone. Jamal smiled, realizing that maybe this was his way forward, not erasing what had happened but using it. Rachel spent her evenings at the mentoring center, connecting with teens who reminded her why she had chosen therapy in the first place. One boy in particular, shy and withdrawn, began to open up under her quiet guidance. Both Jamal and Rachel, in their separate corners of the city, were stitching together new versions of themselves, not whole yet, but no longer broken in the same way. As the seasons changed, Jamal's confidence grew. He started a blog, sharing his writings and thoughts about justice, youth, and identity. The blog gained traction, with readers from across the city and beyond tuning into his voice. Rachel, watching from afar, stumbled upon it one evening and read every post, tears pricking her eyes. She didn't reach out, she knew it wasn't her place, but a quiet pride settled in her chest. Jamal's mother, too, saw the change in her son, the way he stood taller, spoke clearer, and dared to dream again. Rachel's life, though steadier, still bore the cracks of loss. Her license remained revoked, and the path back into her profession seemed nearly impossible. Yet, in mentoring sessions and late-night writing, she found moments of peace. Both of them, without knowing it, were teaching themselves what healing really looked like: slow, messy, and deeply personal. One afternoon, Jamal was invited to a radio show to discuss his blog and his journey. Nervous but excited, he sat in the small studio, headphones on, sharing his truth with whoever was willing to listen. Rachel, sitting in her car during a rainstorm, turned on the radio and froze when she heard his voice. She listened in silence, heart aching with a mix of sorrow and pride. Jamal spoke about second chances, about systems that crush dreams, and about the stubborn hope that keeps people moving forward. After the interview, messages poured in, some supportive, others skeptical, but Jamal stayed focused, knowing that his voice mattered now. Rachel sat in her car long after the interview ended, watching raindrops slide down the windshield, wondering if Jamal knew how far he had come. She whispered into the silence, thanking him without ever expecting an answer. Jamal's story began to take on a life of its own. He was featured in a local magazine, invited to panels, and his blog was nominated for a Youth Advocacy Award. His mother watched with quiet pride, remembering the dark days when they feared he might disappear into anger and isolation. Rachel, too, saw the ripples of his growth, quietly cheering him on from the sidelines. One evening, while volunteering, Rachel was approached by a parent who recognized her and thanked her for helping their child. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt seen not as a headline, but as a human being again. Jamal, walking home from a meeting one night, paused to look up at the stars, breathing in the cold night air. He realized that while his life had been derailed, it hadn't been destroyed. And in that quiet moment, he understood that survival was its own kind of victory. Jamal's school journey remained uncertain. Though he was speaking out and finding his voice, acceptance letters continued to elude him. His mother grew frustrated with the slow progress but kept her faith anchored in Jamal's strength. One afternoon, while checking the mailbox, they received a letter from a small community college offering him a place in a creative writing program. It wasn't what they had originally imagined, but Jamal felt a surge of relief and quiet pride. Rachel, across town, watched new mints come and go, each with their own battles. She no longer expected quick fixes, but every small breakthrough felt meaningful. Late one evening, as she prepared lesson plans, she stumbled across an article on restorative justice, and was struck by how much of her own story was still unfinished. Jamal packed his bag for his first day of college, determined to step into this new chapter, scarred but not defeated. The first day at the community college felt different for Jamal. He was older than some of his classmates, and his past loomed quietly in his mind, but he reminded himself why he was there. His writing class became his sanctuary, a place where he could explore his pain, his hopes, and his identity without judgment. Rachel's days blurred into quiet cycles of mentoring, reading, and searching for ways to contribute. One weekend, she was invited to a local conference to speak about community healing. Nervous but determined, she crafted her talk around the idea of imperfect progress, how healing was messy and nonlinear. Jamal, deep in his coursework, felt a strange calm settling over him. He no longer needed everyone's approval to feel whole. Rachel stood at the podium, voice steady, realizing that while she had lost her title, she had not lost her purpose. Both of them were learning to breathe again. Jamal's writing flourished. His professors took notice, encouraging him to submit his work to local journals. Though hesitant at first, Jamal slowly allowed his words to leave the safety of the classroom. Meanwhile, Rachel's conference speech sparked quiet conversations in her community, and she was soon approached to lead workshops on ethical mentoring. She hesitated, wary of stepping back into a role that had once hurt so much, but something in her knew it was time. Jamal's mother, watching her son juggle school and advocacy, felt a bittersweet pride. She knew the fight had changed them both forever, but watching Jamal rebuild reminded her that no single event could define them. Rachel, standing before her first workshop group, caught a glimpse of herself in a window's reflection and was surprised to see someone stronger than she remembered. Both Jamal and Rachel were piecing together futures that looked nothing like the past, but were theirs to claim. Jamal's first published essay appeared in a local magazine. Seeing his name in print, bold and undeniable, filled him with a quiet power. His mother bought multiple copies, passing them to relatives and neighbors, her pride radiating with every word. Rachel, reading the essay one evening with a cup of tea in hand, felt her heart tighten and swell. She knew it wasn't her place to reach out, but she wished she could tell Jamal how proud she was. At the same time, Rachel's workshops began to grow, with more attendees and deeper conversations. She found herself reconnecting with the core of her work, helping others find clarity and strength, even when the system failed them. Jamal, walking through campus, began to feel less like an outsider. His words had created space for others to speak up too, and that quiet revolution kept him moving forward, step by uncertain step. Jamal's college life settled into a rhythm. Classes, writing, and small moments of peace filled his days. Yet there were still shadows, moments when whispers in the hallway or a lingering stare reminded him of the weight he carried. Rachel's mentoring program grew stronger, but late at night, the loneliness of her losses still crept in. One crisp autumn evening, Jamal was asked to read his latest piece at a citywide youth forum. Standing on the grand stage, his voice echoed with conviction, his words painting pictures of injustice but also of fierce hope. In the audience, a woman sat quietly in the back, Rachel, unnoticed, clutching the event flyer. She listened, her heart pounding, tears streaming as she heard the boy she once tried to help stand tall and proud. Jamal never saw her, but somehow, that night, both of them felt the weight of the past soften just a little. After the youth forum, Jamal received an invitation to contribute regularly to a regional youth magazine. Each piece he wrote felt like a brick in the foundation he was building, steady and intentional. His professors noticed his growth, often using his essays as examples of authentic, powerful storytelling. Rachel, still working quietly behind the scenes, found herself invited to collaborate with a local nonprofit focused on trauma-informed care. It felt like another chance to channel her experience into meaningful change. Jamal's mother, watching her son with renewed hope, began volunteering at his school, wanting to be part of the shift she saw happening. Though Jamal still had days when the weight of his history pressed down hard, these small victories reminded him that healing wasn't about forgetting but about rewriting. Rachel, in her quiet office, drafted a proposal for a citywide mentorship network, her hands steady for the first time in years. One evening, Jamal sat in his small dorm room, reading a letter from a younger student who had been inspired by his writing. The words hit him harder than he expected, a reminder that his pain had been transformed into purpose. Rachel, meanwhile, attended a council meeting to advocate for stronger youth support services. Standing at the microphone, she spoke calmly but firmly, her voice no longer trembling with uncertainty. Jamal's creative writing professor approached him after class, suggesting he apply for a scholarship that would allow him to study abroad. The idea felt impossible at first, him, traveling across the world, but a spark of curiosity ignited. Rachel, reading over feedback from her latest workshop, allowed herself a small smile. Jamal, holding that letter, whispered a quiet promise to himself, to keep pushing forward, no matter how unlikely the path seemed. Both of them were learning that impact often begins quietly. Jamal's application for the scholarship became a project of determination. He poured hours into crafting his personal statement, weaving his journey with honesty and strength. Rachel, too, threw herself into the new mentorship proposal, meeting with local leaders and youth advocates to shape something lasting. Jamal's mother, sitting at the kitchen table late into the night, helped him polish his essay, offering words of encouragement between sips of coffee. Across town, Rachel reviewed reports and outlined visions for change, her mind focused but her heart still bruised by the past. As Jamal submitted his application, he felt a mix of anxiety and hope wash over him. Rachel, finalizing her proposal, experienced a quiet satisfaction, knowing that even if the world didn't always reward her efforts, she was leaving a mark. Both of them, in different corners of the city, held their breath, waiting to see what the next chapter would bring. Weeks passed, and the waiting felt endless. Jamal checked his email obsessively, each unopened message bringing fresh waves of nerves. Rachel presented her mentorship proposal at a major conference, her passion evident in every word. She left the stage to warm applause, her chest tight with pride and exhaustion. Jamal's professors, aware of his application, gently encouraged him to stay patient, reminding him that no matter the outcome, his work already spoke volumes. Rachel received news that her proposal was being considered for citywide implementation, a victory she hadn't dared to dream of when her license was first revoked. One rainy morning, Jamal's inbox pinged with a subject line that made his heart stop. He opened it slowly, breath shallow, eyes scanning the words. Rachel, across town, sat in a quiet cafe, sipping tea, unaware that at that exact moment, Jamal's world was about to shift in a way either of them could have predicted. Jamal had been awarded the scholarship. Staring at the screen, disbelief and joy collided in a rush of tears and laughter. He called his mother first, her proud cries echoing through the phone. Rachel, later that day, scrolling through local news, spotted an article about the scholarship winner and froze. There was Jamal's name, bold and undeniable, his photo beaming confidence. She sat back, tears welling up, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Jamal prepared for the next chapter of his life, packing books and dreams into suitcases, knowing this opportunity was more than just a trip, it was proof that his story was far from over. Rachel stood by her window that evening, watching city lights flicker, her heart full of quiet gratitude. Their paths, once so intertwined and then painfully severed, had led them both to places of growth either could have imagined, still marked by the past but no longer trapped by it. Jamal's departure day arrived with a bittersweet quiet. His mother hugged him tightly at the airport, whispering words of love and hope into his ear. As the plane lifted into the sky, Jamal stared out of the window, a rush of emotions swirling, fear, excitement, pride. Rachel, on that same morning, was hosting her biggest mentorship event yet, standing before a room full of young adults eager for guidance. Even as she spoke confidently, a part of her wondered how Jamal was doing, if he had found peace in the new chapter he was stepping into. Jamal landed in a new city, the unfamiliar streets both intimidating and thrilling. He kept his journal close, writing down every new detail. Rachel, later that night, sat with a colleague, reflecting on how far she had come since the fallout. Both Jamal and Rachel were stepping into new spaces, still tethered to old wounds but carried forward by resilience. In his new environment, Jamal faced fresh challenges. The cultural shifts, the weight of being far from home, and the relentless self-doubt crept in at unexpected times. Yet, every time he picked up his pen, he remembered why he was there. His classmates admired his courage and his sharp, honest voice in workshops. Rachel's mentorship program became a model for other cities, and she was asked to join a task force on youth mental health. Walking into the city hall meeting, she felt the weight of old failures but pushed through, speaking from experience rather than theory. Jamal, after a long day of classes, walked through quiet city parks, feeling both alone and fiercely alive. Rachel, finishing her day, received an email from a parent thanking her for changing their child's life. Both of them, across continents, were redefining what success meant, learning that healing was a process of many small, brave steps. Jamal's essays began gaining recognition in his new school, with professors urging him to compile a full collection. He hesitated, unsure if he was ready to revisit all the pain and triumphs of his past.